Hey, everybody. Just appreciate you all coming in today for our event on alcohol taxation. Um, I'm Jarrett Dieterle from our Street Institute, senior fellow here. I have had some internet difficulties to start out the day, so don't be shocked if somehow I drop off. And we have a plan for that. So appreciate y'all's attendance today, and I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll dive in on this. Um, yeah, so again, I'm Jared Dieterle, and then we've got Adam Hoffer from the Tax Foundation, and Chris Kessler from uh, Black Flannel Brewing and Distilling up in Vermont, and Representative Vanderwall, who is representative in the great state of Michigan, my home state, actually. So, yeah, and so just a brief introductions. I mean, these guys all have very extensive bios, so we won't be able to get into all of it. But yeah, Adam is the director of excise tax policy at the Tax Foundation. Got his PhD in economics from West Virginia and undergrad from Washington Jefferson College before that. He's worn different hats, been a professor of economics, published apparently 30 peer-reviewed academic journal articles, which man, that's 30 more than I think I could stomach, Adam. And then editor of two books as well. So he's a real expert on excise tax. Has written a wonderful paper on modernizing the alcohol tax, and we're going to send as follow-up to this event, multiple different links to things, one of which will be Adam's paper, but it is highly recommended breakdown of our system, and kind of how it got to be what it is, and how it works essentially, because it's not easy. It's not straightforward. And then yeah, Representative Vanderwall is a representative from Michigan, as I mentioned. He represents the 102nd district, which if you're a Michigan knowledgeable person, that's kind of on the western, and then a little bit into the northwestern part of the state, beautiful part of the state up there along Lake Michigan. Before that, he actually was a state senator from 2018 to 2022, representing 12 counties up there. And before that, was a commissioner and chairman for the Mason County Board of Commissioners. And Representative Vanderwall, it says here that you were served on the Michigan Fair Association, which is cool, Western Michigan Fair Association, and we're a district chair for Michigan State University Extension, which might mean you're an MSU fan, but I'll let that go. Yeah, and then finally we have Chris Kessler from Black Flannel Brewing, and man, Chris, you wear like a lot of hats. I was looking at some of the different things you do. Obviously, the founding partner of Black Flannel Brewing Distilling, but you've started several other businesses over the years, and also Chris is in the got into home brewing, and it was actually a top 2 state finalist in Vermont's Make the Cut competition, and was named Vermont's Home Brewer of the Year 2 years in a row, in 2018 and 19. He's a certified Cicerone and a national beer judge, which are very, very prestigious certifications to get. Also, though, because they operate a distillery as well, he wears both hats. He was elected the VP of the Distilled Spirits Council of Vermont, and then also is on the Government Affairs Committee of the Vermont Brewers Association. So he's about as well versed as you could be on these topics. So that's our panelists, and I'll just quickly lay the land here. So alcohol taxation, a lot of you that are probably on this are very familiar with it. Know a lot about it, but for people that maybe are a little less familiar, alcohol is taxed as an excise tax at both the federal and state level. And America has chosen to kind of do it by category or type of alcoholic beverage, so beer, wine, um, spirits, for example, and it's kind of opted for categorizing it that way, which has led to some pretty complicated formulas. If you try to look at the federal excise tax, for example, it's pretty complicated formulas for how it all gets calculated for each of the beverage types. There is a lot of complexity um, to it. An example, if you take something like cider, for example, hard cider, alcoholic cider, even the CO2 level actually can play a role. How many bubbles it has, it's a bubble tax, as it's been called, can play a role on how high the taxation is for cider. So um, there's a lot of complexity to it, and what we're going to hopefully talk about today is maybe some ideas for how to simplify it. One of the biggest issues, just to put some kind of a real world application, is not just an abstract tax debate. One of the big issues we've seen recently has been in the so-called ready to drink category, uh, canned cocktails colloquially, for those that may not know the industry jargon. But um, for those, they often have been available as a malt beverage based drink. I think a lot of people kind of assume that they've always been distilled spirits in them, like an actual mixed cocktail, but that's not always been the case. Popular brands like the White Claws of the world are malt based. And as that category has grown, there's been more interest in it. We've actually seen a lot of things like Jack Daniels and Coca-Cola abroad for decades, but that has certainly come to America and become much more popular. And the issue is that because it's distilled spirits, it is actually taxed at a wildly divergent rate of the malt-based ones. So you can have identical essentially drinks as far as ABV level, but if one's malt based, it's taxed often way less. And there's states that it's like 20, 30 times less. Is really like a large discrepancy. We can get into some of the specifics on that. And also there's kind of correlating access issues around it. So where do these products get sold? Control state where distilled spirits is sold only through a state-run store. Well, is that where the spirit-based RTD should go, or should they go to the grocery store? Right. So there's just a lot of debate right now about where they fit in, how they should be taxed, how they should be available, essentially. And so that's kind of the big real world application right now for this tax debate. It's not just an obscure debate that professors like Adam are interested in. So yeah, so I think I will first kick it over to Representative Vanderwall, just to have him lay out how Michigan approached this issue. They passed legislation that created parity between distilled spirit RTDs and malt-based ones. And so Representative Vanderwall was a sponsor of that bill. And so, Representative, would you mind kind of just giving us an overview of what you all did up there in the Wolverine State?
No problem. Glad to be here today and to discuss really a process that was not real easy to get across the finish line. There was a lot of heated discussion, a lot of really just discussion. What was this going to do to the market? And I think everybody is experiencing a tremendous growth right now in the RTDs, and then we saw the other things that were coming in place. And what really happened is it greatly affected the price and really priced folks out of the market that were producing or shipping in a product. And, we didn't want to disrupt the Michigan system of how beer and wine and things are taxed, but we did feel that we needed to correct this issue because it was skewed in one way what I thought unfavorably. So with a lot of work with you know, our larger beer and wine folks that discussed, and we really came up with a tax system that everybody felt comfortable with. And since it was put in place, um, we've seen, of course, tremendous growth in that area. It spikes up and down with the new flavors that come in, but I think that it's worked very well in the state of Michigan with the industry, especially the beer industry, and we feel the tax has been fairly well implemented, and it's been a really great program. But I will say, I guess, and the biggest thing is, you know, how we really worked it is we sat down when the bills get introduced in the state of Michigan. It goes through a process of a committee meeting, but really in the beginning, when it was brought up, there was some things that they had concerns with, and we worked through those concerns, and it's brought us into a very competitive state, and it's been really good for the industry in a whole here.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Did you get pushback from any quarters in particular with it? You mentioned kind of sitting down at that table with the different stakeholders. Was there any particular constituency or group that had concerns?
Well, you know, anytime in the state of Michigan, because we're a 3-tier system, that you start messing around with the that there's always some concerns, and we just needed to make sure that when we sat down with everybody involved, that we just kind of went through and made sure that we didn't, you know, because we could have actually put this bill out and unfairly tax them less than what we would have taxed our normal malt based or the beer. And what we did is we sat down, took those things, went back to the table, and then we'd rework the bill with an amendment, come back, we'd meet with them again, go through some more of the committee process. And, you know, did we have serious pushback? I think just concerns. And to be honest with you, everything that they brought up was legitimate. And you know, when you do a bill, sometimes you don't think of all the integral parts that are put in place when it comes to the alcohol side. And we just worked through those things, and you know what, it was a really good process, a learning experience for me, but really good for the industry overall in the state of Michigan.
Yeah, I imagine it's been a nice boon there for some of the really great distilleries in the state there. So yeah, Chris, let's hop over to you here and give us a little flavor of the Vermont experience. You testified on behalf and were part of getting the access expansion. And I'll let you explain that to make sure I don't miss anything, but getting it kind of out of the state system and the private distribution, but then also you are part of what it sounds like is maybe an upcoming effort to try to get into some of the tax parity issues as well. So why don't you tee up
Sure.
happenings in Vermont for us?
Okay. I'll give you a little bit of background. So Black Flannel, we opened in July of 2020, right at the beginning of COVID, which was interesting. But we are currently the only brewery and distillery combination in the state of Vermont. I know there's a few others that might be in planning. We have a full service restaurant, seats about 150 to 300 people, depending on the day. We have multiple spaces, barrel room, events room. We have our distillery manufacturing, tasting room. And a very large bar in our main dining room. So our original plan was to serve and sell only our beer and spirits and cocktails on site, but because of COVID, we had to pivot, and so we started to include canned beer self-distribution. And so, you know, Vermont, and the landscape in Vermont is that it's a small state. We have 650,000 people. Burlington's our largest city. We're about 10 miles or 10 minutes from Burlington. Burlington has a whopping 45,000 people. And Vermont is a control state, which means that our spirits are sold. So anything over a certain ABV is sold through the state as the distributor. And because our organizational structure is, we actually have two legal entities. The brewing is one, distilling is the other. We actually have to sell our spirits to the state, then they sell them to a retailer, and we have to drive to the retailer to pick them up to serve them 50 feet away from where they're manufactured. So pretty crazy. Vermont consumers support a robust craft beer industry. Vermont is #1 in the U.S. per capita for density of craft breweries. It's also the #1 in the country in terms of its economic impact to the state. It's not quite the same level of support and size for the distilling community in our state, and I imagine it's the same for many other states. And so it's a little bit more difficult. You know, a lot of our customers will come in every week and buy one or more 4-packs of beer, but they're coming in and buying maybe one bottle of spirits, and it could be all year because people consume it slower unless they're making cocktails with say our tequila or our agave-based spirit. So it's harder to reach profitability. So what we did was looked at the ready-to-drink canned cocktails as an potential avenue to reach profitability, and it has. So that's proven worthwhile. Problem was as of 2021, 22, because we're a control state and it's a spirit-based product, we could only distribute it to about 8 through 80 stores statewide because it's a control state. Whereas malt counterparts of a ready-to-drink cocktail could distribute to 2,000 stores statewide. So I worked with some other distillers, some local legislators, and we had the commissioner of liquor and lottery on our side as well to try to get that out of state control and into private distribution. So I was very involved with, and it was interesting because it was against the brewers who were really pushing to keep it in state control because they didn't want the competition on the shelves, among other things. And so, but ultimately in 2022, we won that battle and it went to private distribution as of July 1st, 2022. Part of that, though, in passing the legislation was that in the last minute, the Senate Finance Committee said, okay, we're going to do it, but at a different tax rate, at a higher tax rate, at $1.10 per gallon. Whereas beer for similar ABVs, if it's up to 6%, it's 26.5 cents per gallon versus 55 cents per gallon, which is 6% or over 6% for beer. So it's either anywhere from 2 to 4 times higher for spirit-based ready-to-drink canned cocktails. And just a quick thing about RTDs, ready-to-drink. There's multiple types there's malt-based, which generally has 43% of the market, hard kombucha, hard teas, which have 37%. Wine is about 9%, spirit-based about 11%. And around 2021 or 2, I think it was $800 million industry, and it's projected to be about a $2.5 billion industry by 2030. So there's a lot of room for growth, and it has been our distillery's path toward profitability. Without it, I imagine our distillery might have closed by now. So, and it's really my effort this year, and I tried last year. What happened was because it had been a couple of years, I approached local legislators and said, we'd like to receive parity on the tax and lower that tax rate for RTDs. And their response was, well, we're looking for revenue sources. So let's talk about raising beer to the same level as RTDs. Like, no, don't mess with beer, you know? So we backed off of that fight for last year, but we're trying to feel our way and see if the legislature is more open to the reduction without messing with the beer tax at this point. So There you go.
Yeah. Boy, that I saw Adam there nodding his head and laughing because I'm sure he's ran into that old move before, equalized by raising everyone's taxes. But yeah, Adam,
Right.
let's hop over to you. And by the way, I put this in the chat, everyone, but I forgot to mention, if anyone has questions, you can definitely throw them in the Q&A feature. We'll get to as many as we can for anyone watching. So apologize for not mentioning that when we started. But Adam, you've written a really great paper about modernizing the alcohol tax system. You have multiple ideas for doing so. Um, First of all, there's anything that has already been said that you want to comment on, obviously feel free to do so. But I'd love to also get some of your thoughts about what are some bigger picture ways that the system could be modernized and revamped, if you will, and maybe also getting into a little bit of the double layer of taxation, both at the federal level and the state level. So.
Yeah, I appreciate the introduction, Jared, and I thought you did a great job of describing the landscape earlier of where alcohol taxes are right now in the country. I think an easy way to summarize it is that it's really messy. It's a really confusing system, and what I wanted to take the time to do this year is to start with a little thought experiment. If we were going to design, if there were no taxes in place and we were designing them from scratch right now, what would that look like? And the simple answer is it would look nothing like what we actually have today. It's on the easier side to understand how we got to the messy categorical system that we have today. Going back 100 years or more, right? There were actually pretty well-defined category lines, right? Hard spirits were very different than beer, which was very different than wine. And so you could put them into categories. And then the problem caused by the relative categories was also very different. And so you could understand differential tax rates using the category system. Now, we've had this, what I think is an absolutely wonderful problem to have, and that there's been a tremendous amount of innovation in the alcohol space. That's been a huge win for consumers, right? We have all sorts of different alcohol products to enjoy, made in a variety of different ways, right? Now, what has really lagged in that is the tax system, right? So I think almost everyone recognizes that the categorical system is rather flawed, right? Like not everything fits into beer, wine, or spirit. The federal government had to make a separate category for ciders a little over a decade ago. And now we have lots of new products that really blur the lines even further. And so, again, thinking through this thought process, if we were to design an alcohol tax from scratch, I actually think it's really easy to think about what that would look like, because you could just tax products by how much alcohol they have. The products that they already say how much alcohol is in each container. And so if we just made the tax by alcohol, the amount of alcohol in a product, then we tax the alcohol and this tax system parity goes away, the categories go away. Alcohol is alcohol, and that's how we tax it. Now that's a pretty straightforward alcohol by volume tax. The exact rate we could talk about for several weeks, right? How high that rate should be and what it should look like. But from my perspective, at least, that's the simplest and most straightforward way to tax alcohol products. Now,
Yeah.
I said if this becomes completely infeasible, at the very least, we're going to need a whole bunch of more categories, right? We're not unaccustomed to adding more categories. Again, we've shown the willingness to do so as new products come on the market, but even more products are going to continue to come on the market, right? These malt-based seltzers, you have the ready-to-drink cocktails. Again, you can look at this and you can see two products with identical alcohol content side by side on a shelf, and one will have 3 to 30 times the tax rate as the other. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so one way you could solve that is by continuing to expand the categories. But again, that's second best at best, because who is to say that innovation is done? I think it's not done, right? Like the kombucha category is growing substantially, right? And you can make alcohol out of almost any product on the planet that has sugar in it. And so I think we're going to continue to see more products come to market that don't look like the other products that we're going to try to squeeze them into, a category for taxation. Right?
Yeah.
The simplest way to do this would be a tax by alcohol content. And that, again, that is a more neutral tax. It addresses the parity across products and categories. and is also, again, just straightforward for current people in the market and future innovators.
Yeah, Adam, I appreciate you laying that out. Yeah, and yeah, we could spend all day for sure going through some of the different what those rates could be, but that's a good way of framing it up. One of the and actually to your point too about different products too, just while I think of it, I mean, we've already seen that with like the so-called crossover beverage categories where like there's the hard Mountain Dews and stuff of the world. And again, like that's a product that just we're not familiar with that. Like we're not we're not used to like alcohol being in Mountain Dew. And so there will be more stuff that we're not even thinking of right now that's gonna come down the pike. So um, and one of the kind of main pushbacks that I've seen, at least with the pushing for tax parity, is that beer, malt based wine is different, quote unquote, than spirits, than distilled spirits. And we've taken the position at the R Street Institute that that ultimately, alcohol is alcohol, given the ABV level is what matters. Obviously, no one disputes there's a difference, between a bottle of bourbon and a lager, but also the quantity that you drink of those things is different, right? You drink less of the hard spirit, but in the RTD context in particular, many times the ABV level is identical. You can take some of the popular brands that are vodka-based RTDs and compare that to the malt-based ones, and they're the same. Sometimes even lower ABV rates. Chris, I've never found that alcohol, that alcohol is different. To me, alcohol is alcohol. Have you ran into that argument? Do you have any thoughts on that for someone that makes both types of alcohol? I feel like you potentially
Sure.
have some good thoughts on that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of nuanced arguments that comes through, from beer, from other categories. One of the big ones we ran into was that because of the nature of spirits, a lot of distilleries around the country don't actually distill anything. They buy their spirits from a plant, like MGP in Indiana, for example, and they'll receive it in a big tote. They'll put it in a bottle, put a label on it, and sell it. Or they might put it through a still and create a gin from it, from a neutral spirit, or whatever the case may be. Where we take it from sugar source to glass, and so we're really applying the full craft across the board. So the argument from a lot of beer producers is, well, it's a lot cheaper, a lot less expensive for spirit producers to produce an RTD product, say at 6% ABV. So ABV to them isn't as relevant. It's more about how it's produced and the cost to produce it. And that's true for some distillers. It might be very inexpensive for them to produce a 6% RTD, where for us, it actually is, we calculated it's almost 240% higher to produce that. And then on top of that, we have that 2 to 4 times tax on top of it. So it makes it a lot harder to compete. But it's not impossible. But being able to reduce that and get parity based on the ABV, for us at least makes sense. And I'm hearing that there is legislative support for that idea. That makes a lot of sense to them. It's just a matter of how that is approached. Do we bring beer up to match RTDs, or do we bring RTDs or somewhere in the middle?
Mm-hmm.
I personally want it to come down, because I think if you start to mess with the taxation of other categories, it's gonna put people out of business essentially. So
Yeah. And I mean, there's states. I think Adam, you might be 50 times higher, the rate for spirit RTDs than malt and beer. There's other examples. I think not to pick on the Upper Midwest, but Minnesota, I think, is like 3 times higher. So it can be really broad and extreme, and even if someone is just getting their distilled product from somewhere, if the tax rate's high enough, it still could be expensive at the end of the day. To Chris's point, And yeah, I think that one of the things to keep in mind with the ABV level tethering is that it really doesn't necessarily preference or help any one category, where it may quote unquote help the spirit-based RTDs. Again, there would be a theoretically higher tax rate for a bottle of bourbon, for example, which is obviously spirit-based. So it helps in some ways and hurts in some ways for the spirits folks, and therefore it's not really, as far as I see, putting a thumb on the scale of any one beverage category in a very competitive market across beverage categories. Adam, what is that right? Is my kind of thought on that correct? That it's not obvious that it would benefit any one sector of the industry over the other?
Well, so I think the whole point of an alcohol by volume tax is that it's a neutral tax. It taxes the alcohol as alcohol, regardless of its source, right? Whether you're starting with grapes or corn or wheat, and regardless of how you convert that to alcohol, you just tax it all the same. The biggest challenge in implementing any of these changes is that we currently have a system with preferential rates, right? Beer and wine get substantial tax preference per ounce of alcohol compared to spirits, and so changing that would absolutely be a movement in favor of spirits. There's no doubt about that. And sort of as we heard earlier, right, the idea of harmonizing rates or parity across categories can be achieved multiple ways, right? And I think this is where we've seen the largest pushback by some policymakers and some very vested industry participants, is that for example, I had a conversation with someone that had their own vineyard, right? And they said, are you suggesting that we quadruple the tax on wine? I said, no, like that's not at all what we're saying. I would like to see harmonized rates that are even lower than where they are now. I think the Craft Beverage Modernization Act did a good job to lower alcohol tax rates at the federal level. I think there's still a lot more room to go. But a change from the system right now would definitely create winners and losers, notably winners for spirits and losers in beer and wine. And those losses could come in different ways, right? Either, we're not suggesting to increase the tax rate on beer and wine to equalize it. That would be, a massive loss to beer and wine, but, rather a reduction in the spirits tax rate. But even that then is still advantageous for spirits, because it would, give them more of a price advantage, or I guess you could say less of a price disadvantage that they currently have now, and would likely swing some market share in their direction. The other challenge, as we heard from Representative Vanderwall and also from Chris, once you start decreasing tax rates, you're now going to start decreasing revenue for the state, and so that's going to be an even harder push. Equalizing tax rates, in my opinion, is the best way to have an alcohol tax policy, but transitioning from here to there is absolutely a challenge.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, and I think that you're right. It may at the mixed RTD category, certainly would help spirits to have it be equalized, and but again, at the same time, it gets higher on the top end, right? When you get into those bottles of distilled spirits that would be taxed much higher than beer, for example, or wine. You mentioned the growth of the craft beverage industry, and that's something that we've done some work on at our street and looked at. Really, I think a lot of people don't conceptualize that it's really one of the most promising and best sources of manufacturing jobs in the United States. People, tend to think of like the steel industry or the auto industry for manufacturing jobs, but that's not so. And it's actually a lot of the small distillers and brewers across the country. Before the pandemic, they even were producing, I think, like the second most manufacturing, jobs, or at least the second most highest growth, I should say, in manufacturing jobs of any industry, the alcohol industry. So I wanted to pivot to you, Representative Vander Wal, because you'd mentioned kind of some of the help that this had brought to the industry for those jobs. I mean, the Michigan, certainly has a well-known beer industry, and also, I know from being from there, certainly in the spirits category as well. But can you talk a little bit more about some of the benefits y'all have seen from this?
Absolutely. And I, just to jump back and kind of go over a couple things, there was some discussions the same way of, how do we do the tax and where do we go? And, basically pulling some of these out of state-run facilities in, the state of Michigan. All hard liquor is distributed through a central system, and the profits, the state makes the money off that tax. And the discussion was really, if we remove this product out of the state run, how do we make up that difference? And really what it did, and what was very beneficial, is, of course, it increased the items being available at a fair price, and we actually increased the volume, and we actually exceeded the tax that we were getting that was going inside the state-run facility. So I think the thing that you really need to look at is that, our beer products are taxed, we feel, fairly, by moving this product into that same structure and pulling it out of the state run. If it fell under and I can't right now, I don't remember the alcohol content per volume, that if it stays under that, it could go, direct sale to the store from a distributor. We've actually increased the sales, and it's been a very strong market for the state of Michigan, and the state, has reaped more profit out of it because we increased the volume. And of course it helped, just like black flannel, it just helps the ultimate part of more employment, more opportunities for businesses to grow and be active parts of the community. So I'll say overall, it's been a very strong move for the state of Michigan, worked well.
Representative, was it a bipartisan effort there as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. And I can't remember the exact vote. It was, a solid victory when the bill went on the floor. So it was a true bipartisan bill, and, we had the state buy into all the changes and what we did, and it's proved to be a big win, really truly, for the entire industry.
Well, maybe there is one topic that can bring Americans together in the political arena. Yeah, well, that's good to hear. Yeah, certainly. Chris, what would it, if you get a bill passed that could, create that parity that we've talked about, that would bring, not raise, but bring down the spirits tax, what would that mean for your business, for you guys? What do you think? I mean, I know you may not have exact numbers of like how many sales it would generate, but what do you think that it would mean
Sure.
for you in the market?
I think certainly having a higher level of profitability with lower tax rate would allow us to hire at least one more person. We've been on the fence about hiring a market rep, a salesperson. In our state, we're also through a Class 4 license, which is a tasting room. We're able to have up to 10 tasting rooms throughout the state. We recently closed one down because it just wasn't selling that much, and we couldn't really afford to have somebody staff that. If with a lower tax rate and the way the RTDs are growing, we could have kept that one open and sold at a higher rate at that Class 4 location. So I think it would allow us to help with the sales effort and potentially expand. With the class fours, we don't have to sell through the state. It's taxed, but we essentially keep the proceeds of any bottle sales there at those locations. So I think it would just have a compounding effect. It would allow us to grow the distillery faster and then create more jobs with that. And I mean, we're small, so it might be one to start, and then within the next year, maybe two more. And then, but you talk about, 20 to 30 distilleries, then all of a sudden you're talking 30, 60 jobs, and that just will grow for a small state like ours. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's the kind of the beauty of the diversified, small market, in the craft spirits, the small players in it. It kind of creates this bubble up effect that helps everyone. And from my experience, just anecdotally, a lot of the people that work in the craft industry tend to stay in it. It's not just they're punching a year or something as like a store clerk somewhere. They have an interest in it, and oftentimes they will go off and start their own operation or expand their experience in the field. So it's definitely a career building field as well,
Mhm.
I think. And yeah, no, I appreciate that, Chris. I think that another thing to keep in mind, again, I mentioned this earlier, but we've talked quite a bit about the RTD context here. But there, I think, is a perception in the country that that the distilling community, the craft beverage community generally is just in boom times and everything's hunky dory, and it's this unstoppable train. Got through COVID, get through anything, and it is really the envy of the world. But there have been a rash of small distillery closures recently, and they're all is not just perfect, and it is a very difficult business enterprise. A lot of cost going into it to actually make that profitable and survive. And so I think that anything that can be done to create potential additional, business expansion opportunities is important, whether that's direct to consumer shipping, which is something we've supported at our street, or the equalizing of products like RTDs that allow more revenue streams. We got a question here. We've got a couple questions coming in that I want to spend a little time on. I think these are some important things. This will be an interesting one. Maybe I know I have some thoughts about this. Adam, you might, Chris, everyone might actually. But what about the fact that higher ABV drinks are absorbed more quickly, and therefore can lead to more rapid intoxication, which obviously could lead to things like alcohol poisoning? And what about the studies that show that tax policies that push people towards lower ABV products reduce alcohol-related harm? And so kind of the argument being that if you tax, the ethanol the same, then you're putting a disincentive on consuming the higher ABV versus lower ABV versus a tax system that might incentivize people to go towards the lower ABV. Adam, do you have any thoughts on that? I'll let you start.
Yeah, so I mean, I think real quick, a tax by ABV still encourages people to, like, if you drink 10% or 40% alcohol, like the more alcohol you drink, you're paying more tax. Lower alcohol by volume, yes, 2-5% beers are, you're likely to drink those over more time than 10%. But one of the options in our paper, we included an option for a tax policy that increases exponentially by alcohol by volume. I honestly think it's rather complex. It would add too much complexity to the system for the actual gains that you're going to see, because at home you can mix your own cocktail and make it as strong or as weak as you want, right? But I think it's important to emphasize here that more alcohol will still cost more money in tax. And yes, ideally, that same amount of alcohol consumption is spread out over time, but you're still looking at a system where more alcohol consumption, you pay more tax for that.
Yeah. Chris, do you have any thoughts on this as someone who makes both spirit and beer?
Yeah, I agree that it's really a matter of volume. You know, you have a 6%, 12-ounce 6% beer versus 12 ounces of a 80% spirit. Yeah, that's going to be a health issue. But you know, the spirits are taxed at a much higher rate, which is fine with us. I think that makes sense. And you know, there's this argument like, with the spirit-based RTDs, the beer tried to make this argument. It's a gateway drug to, you know, youth consumption of spirits, which is proven to be, you know, substantially more harmful to people. You know, if you're consuming a high volume of a high spirit alcohol, true. But what's false is it's not a gateway drug. I mean, it's a very different product. You know, it's mixed with ours is mixed with like fresh fruits and vegetables, local ingredients, and you know, it's a low alcohol product. You might have one or two, and have the same effect as one or two low alcohol beers. So I think the parity issue for me is really on the low ABV side, not as you increase the ABV.
Yeah. The other thing I'd throw in too is that, I mean, the market, people, I think, have overlooked the market response that has been ongoing in the alcohol space. First of all, I've told, you know, multiple people that are outside the industry this, and they're like shocked. But the youth drinking rate has been plummeting. And it's gone down significantly from the almost like half from, I believe, from the 80s to 90s, maybe over half. And so, yeah, the idea that you know, we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the gateway for youth overlay. And also, there's been the low ABV, no ABV kind of movement that's been ongoing, that more people are expressing often a preference for that, which a lot of the studies that were done were in, you know, a very different era when we were just comparing, you know, maybe a whiskey with a macro lager beer, and it is much more complex. People are much more likely to drink across the categories now, particularly the younger generations. They have much less brand loyalty. They're more likely to do a cocktail and then segue to a beer and maybe finish with a wine. So I think that you just need to keep in mind where some of the trends are going overall in the marketplace with that. And there also is the overlay, which we don't have time to get into here, another discussion for another day, has been the potential revisement of the US dietary guidelines around recommended alcohol intake. And that is likely to have a very large impact on people's perceptions, perhaps even more than tax rates. Again, we don't have time to bite that one off today, but we got another question here, Adam, maybe a clarification one. If you don't have the exponential system, wouldn't someone face the same tax for a 1.5 ounce shot versus a 12-ounce beer? And should people be taxed or encouraged the same amount to drink shots as they are to drink beer?
So the short answer is yes, those would have the same tax, right? So 0.6 ounces of ethyl alcohol in a 1.5 ounce shot, 0.6 ounces of ethyl alcohol in a 12-ounce beer would have the same tax. Now, the implication of encouraging people to drink one versus the other, I'm not saying that we need people to switch their consumption. You know, the implied argument here is, isn't a 12-ounce beer safer to consume than a 1.5 ounce shot? But what we're talking about here is a broader market, right? Like, it's 1.5 ounces of alcohol in, let's call it the same 1.5 ounce shot, but poured into 12 ounces of tequila, it's the same amount of alcohol, right? And now you're talking about a product that should have the same tax rate, presumably, as the 12-ounce beer if they have the same amount of alcohol in them. And, you know, yes, you can drink 1.5 ounces of alcohol more quickly in a shot than a 12-ounce beer. Although I went to college and I know some people that can drink 12 ounces of beer really quickly. I've seen it happen a lot. So the fundamental principle there is yes, they would have the same tax rate, right? Regardless of what those are mixed into or combined with, you're taxing the fundamental amount of alcohol in the drink the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then to that last point, I mean, like, you know, there's different kinds of ways that you drink a quote unquote shot. I mean, there's certainly the kids that are at the bar, you know, the college age, you know, people over 21 that are slamming them at the bar. That's very different. You know, when I was 22, doing that with cheap tequila than like now sipping on a nice tequila. You know, now that I have gray in my beard, and you know, that's something that I enjoy over a much longer period of time. And so, yeah, you know, it's going to be hard to break down those things in any kind of a tax code between that. We got another question here that is there any thoughts on whether the beer companies that now also make and sell spirit-based RTDs would lobby against making these equally available? Representative Vanderwall, did you where were the did you hear a lot from beer companies? You know, as much as you're able to talk about, you know, I know some of that stuff's obviously not public, just the negotiations, but did you get a lot of pushback from the beer community? Do you remember any breweries that might have also made you know, spirit-based RTDs being involved in any of those discussions?
Yeah, you know, yes, we certainly had discussion with all the major distributors or beer companies about what this would do and what the general effect would be. But the agreement, you know, between all of them was that, you know, if we continue to fairly tax, the market is going to level itself off and play. And, you know, we worked it out, and to be honest with you, they were in agreement. You know, it took a little work to work because nobody ever wants to give up any volume, and there's always that threat. But a national product is being advertised and it's being run through, so it didn't really affect their market share in what they did. But they just wanted to make sure that that product didn't come in and it was at a lower level than what they were paying coming into the state of Michigan. And that when we got that agreement and we worked through all those tax rates, there wasn't an issue there. They're certainly going to be concerned and they want to be involved with that, but that's part of being, you know, a good legislator, is making sure that all stakeholders have an opportunity to voice their concern or voice some changes that they would like to see in the legislation, and that's what we did.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, and certainly there has been a trend of some of the you know, both smaller scale brewers like Chris, and some of the big dogs getting more into the spirit-based RTDs. Chris, what have you heard on that? Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to imagine sometimes you maybe like walking into like a brewers guild meeting in Vermont, and I don't know if you're persona non grata there because because of what you're doing.
No.
Or if not, yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about that experience for you.
Yeah, I've kind of been able to navigate that thin line between being brewer and distiller, and I think people appreciate on both breweries and distilleries the fact that I'm kind of one foot in both camps. So that way I can kind of bridge the gap. When right now I actually just received an email a couple of days ago from the brewers, the Brewers Association in Vermont, who is trying to reach out to all the different stakeholders in spirits and wine and mead and cider, to talk about the upcoming legislative session and what's everybody's agenda and how can we come up with a compromise. Because when you go to the legislature and everybody's in agreement, you're generally going to have a much easier time getting the legislation through. So, but things like the taxation is always going to be, we're going to ruffle some feathers, I think. And when I went through it, I sat in on the Government Affairs Committee sessions with the Brewers Association, and they were saying a lot of arguments and against private distribution of RTDs. And I was right up front with everybody. We want to bring these to market, and they respected being transparent, and just say, if you want me to step off these calls, or we did it virtually for a long time. I'm happy to do so. And they only asked me to step off once. So when it got toward the end, and they were really scrambling to try to get their point of view through and whatnot. But yeah, it hasn't been that difficult, I think. But you had mentioned before about the spirits have there's a lot of distilleries who we're seeing going out of business. We're also seeing that in the brewing industry too. There's definitely a downturn, especially at the production breweries. Our business model is a little different because we're more of a brew pub, and we have everything is really craft focused. So we've built a community around ourselves within our, and I think we're seeing growth. But we've also in Vermont, we've had a couple of breweries go out of business this year, and I think we're going to see some more. All of that is affected by tax rate. And the other side of this is that, I mentioned if we can be more profitable with a lower tax rate, there's also the consumer side. It gives us the opportunity to lower the prices a bit on the products, so that helps the consumer as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I appreciate that overview. And I mean, certainly, maybe it's not a bad note to end on, but certainly there are more access channels too that could be expanded generally for really all categories of the alcohol marketplace. We've alluded to direct to consumer, but that's obviously something that brewers and distillers alike want to see expanded, to give them a way to get directly to market stuff that's very unremarkable in another business, another industry. And it's just like, yeah, I want to sell my products to consumers, and everyone's like, of course you do, you're a business. But that can be tricky in the alcohol space, right, with the wholesaler tier. So there's certainly a lot of ways that the industry could be made more smooth, more deregulatory, and more high functioning, which ultimately helps everyone, whether it's creating jobs in Michigan or in Vermont, or maybe even we can get something done at the federal level. But don't anyone cross their fingers too much on that, because they'll be holding them for a long time. Yeah, well, I think that we're up against time here, but I appreciate everyone attending this. I'd like to thank our panelists, Chris, Adam, and Representative Vanderwall. This is a great breakdown of not a super easy topic. So I think that we did pretty well with it overall. And yeah, to everyone watching, thank you again. I hope you all are able to get out there and enjoy craft beverage of your choice, and that you're not taxed too highly on it. So until then, y'all, take care, and cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.